Hello and welcome to another episode of Liberty Coin and Precious Metals Radio. Today is November 15th, 2011. We're getting to the end of the year here. Today we're going to talk about the Occupy movement and what they are lacking, namely gold and silver. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of these occupiers need to look towards gold and silver as not only a hedge against inflation, which it is, or an investment, but also as a political movement. We've seen Max Kaiser talk about his campaign, Buy Silver, Crash JP Morgan. He has a logic behind that, namely that as the dollar gets weaker and weaker, gold and silver are going to appreciate in value. The more gold and silver appreciate in value, that's going to send signals throughout the market that the dollar is in distress. And these paper instruments like the dollar and derivatives is one way in which a lot of these corporations or banks that the Occupy movement has focused a lot of their attention on get their power.
Yeah, I think that what's happening with the Occupy Wall Street movement right now is great. There's definitely a general awareness that's happening right now, but I think there's always the argument between are they, a real freedom movement or is it a communist movement? I think if we can get the education out there and see, there's definitely the frustration out there, but how have you been manipulated your entire life? And a lot of it comes down to the fractional reserve banking. There's also the aspect of crony capitalism where the corporations are allowed to go to the government and buy undue influence from the U.S. government at the expense of the American people. So, one of the things that the banks were allowed to do is essentially make bad bets. And of course, if you can make a bad bet and not have any risk associated with it, you're going to do it. You're going to make a lot of money in the process. And when it goes bad for you, typically what would happen in a free market economy is that you would go under because you had made bad investments. What's happened now with this crony capitalism is that the taxpayer dollars has been used to benefit the corporations at the expense of the people. This wouldn't happen if we actually had a sound monetary policy. So I think it's important for people to actually do their research, take their anger, but have the research to back that anger, and that generally lies with the fact that we don't have any real monetary system. We can create our money and inflate it to the politicians' delight. Actually, more than the politicians' delight, the politicians are not even allowed to know what happens in the Federal Reserve System.
Mm-hmm. I think that what a lot of the frustration points to in the Occupy movement is the devaluing of the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. And I think that this is actually a systematic policy that's being run by central banks across the world. Of course, like you mentioned, the Federal Reserve. But the Federal Reserve is not federal, as so many people know these days. It's actually a public-private, at best, endeavor. Mostly it's private. It's owned by a lot of these big banks out of Wall Street, out of France, out of Germany. It has international relations with these companies, and the systematic devaluing of the dollar is one of the, I think, core issues of our time. And one way to protect yourself against that devaluing is to buy a little bit of silver here or there, buy gold, put it away, forget about it, save.
Yeah, I think a lot of what's happened is that people wonder why we have inflation. I can remember being a child and my parents would say, man, things are getting so expensive. And they never really stopped to realize why the things are getting expensive. In the early 1950s, a family was able to support itself with a higher standard of living than we have now with just one person in the household working. Today, that's not possible. I really like our hero Ron Paul when he pointed out in one of the debates when there was actually an issue associated with gasoline and why it's so high and maybe what we could do to get the gas prices down. And Ron Paul brought up, how we could have a gallon of gasoline for 10 cents. What he was referring to was when we actually used to have silver based in our currency, and a silver dime now would get you almost a gallon of gas.
It's really core, I think, that these occupiers understand the money issue and what their money actually is. When you look at these dollars that you have in your pocket, it's pretty clear to realize that they aren't dollars. They're actually Federal Reserve notes. They're private instruments that are issued by a private bank, essentially. It isn't a public currency. It's not a currency printed for the public good. It's a private endeavor which, as cliche as it sounds, funnels wealth up to the top of the pyramid. One way, I think, to move away from that fiat system is to look towards other commodities whose values are dictated by the marketplace. So you need to look towards a free market in currencies. You need to look towards alternative sources of wealth building and value building, which I think touches on a question that we always talk about here at Liberty Coin and Precious Metals is, what is value? When you have your gold or silver or platinum or palladium, does it make much sense to think of it in terms of dollars or Federal Reserve notes, or does it make more sense to look at it in terms of ounces? If you say, oh, I've got X amount of dollars in silver, you're skewing your view of what you own because you're judging it by a consistently depreciating currency. And so when you do that, it definitely skews what exactly it is you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gold is actually down in relationship to the median price of homes in the last decade. So what you see with that is typically gold is maintaining its purchasing power. What's happened is that housing has gotten inflated because there was excess currency in the system, that excess currency they could create at whim. I think one of the things that you'll see in the future is that you'll be able to buy a house with essentially the same amount of ounces of gold that you could in the past. What I really want to say to the Occupy Wall Street people and the protesters and the people that are becoming aware that there's a real problem in the system is, do some research. So you point out the fact that there's a problem with the corporations, and somehow there's not really an association of that with the government. And one of the ways the American people gets fleeced through inflation is because the government can essentially print more money at a whim. And what they do is they'll have no bid contracts that go out to the corporations. At that time, that money has the initial value when it first hit the system. But by the time it trickles down to everybody else in the system, you're left with a devalued dollar. When you're holding gold, silver, platinum, palladium, that's not happening. You're holding on to something real. And as there's more currency in the system, those items are actually appreciating because people don't want the devaluation of the dollar.
Mm-hmm. I think this dollar devaluation topic is something that for a lot of people is second nature. It's very clear that that is what happens to currencies over time because we've experienced it, our parents have experienced it, and we anticipate that our children are going to experience it. I think where the leap of faith comes in for a lot of people is how do they protect themselves against that? So when you mention commodities or traditional monies like gold and silver, commodities, platinum, palladium, it's something that I think is difficult for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. Wherefore, I'm not quite sure. But when you try to push them towards something, they'll say gold's in a bubble, silver's in a bubble, it's almost time to sell. But I think what we're experiencing now is sort of a trans bubble in gold and silver. I think it's an extraordinary market. So we're not seeing these commodities run into bull markets like stocks would. I think we're seeing a transformation of the global monetary system. We're going to see a transitory period in which these commodities or traditional monies could reassert themselves as basically cruxes of the global financial system.
Yeah, I think we are in a transitional period. That was a great point. One of the things that's happening in this market is people traditionally are willing to trade in the paper certificates, the ETFs. We're seeing a huge strain on the physical markets because people are demanding that they hold the gold and silver in their hands. So we are definitely in transitional times.
Mm-hmm. Some people don't like silver because it's so volatile, but I think what we see more and more is it divorce itself from its industrial uses and assert itself as money, like we said so many times, Joe. You're seeing it, for instance, when MF Global went bankrupt. Instead of being rattled, silver held its own. Mm-hmm. When we've seen the stock market go down 2,000 points over a few weeks' time, we've seen it hold its own. So we're seeing a lot of resilience out of silver. And now, to bring this back around to the Occupy movement, I think it's very important for these individuals to somehow really protect their wealth, protect their savings, and not stick out in some ways. Meaning basically that you can do a lot of evening out in the system simply by allocating your money in a smart, safe way than you can by making huge political statements out in the streets.
Right. I think, it was Max Kaiser who did the crash J.P. Morgan buy silver. And as you take your money out of the fiat currency and you put it into something else, you're taking away the power. You've taken away the manipulation. You're actually taking control of your own life yourself. So that's probably the major message that I think the Occupy Wall Street needs to understand.
And so for those out there who don't really understand this conflation between silver and J.P. Morgan inherited a huge short position in silver over the last few years. And in so doing, they've had a vested interest in making sure that the silver price remained low. In order to do so, what JP Morgan has had to do is print innumerable paper contracts in order to sort of stamp down the silver market, the physical silver market. And so what they'll do is they'll place huge sell orders on the market floor in order to keep the price of silver down. Now, over the last 2 years, as you've seen silver creep up in price, you've also seen the JP Morgan price kind of edge down. And so what this implies to investors is that there is a lot of risk on the balance sheets of JP Morgan the higher that silver price goes and the lower the JP Morgan stock price goes. So there might be some point of conflation which will signal bearish outlooks for JP Morgan, bullish outlooks for silver. They've done a great job at keeping silver down, but what they cannot do is continue to keep it down because their paper assets continue to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as commodities appreciate and paper instruments depreciate. And this is where Kaiser's Crash JP Morgan Buy Silver campaign comes in. He says that for every ounce of silver that one takes out of the market, you then take away thousands of ounces of power out of the hands of JP Morgan.
Yeah, that's probably the key thing, is to remember that the physical is what's going to essentially win in the end.
Yeah. For many years in our country, silver was used as currency. We were on a partial silver standard, if not a full silver standard, for a while. In our coinage up until 1965, there was a 90% silver content. This was taken out under the guise of there was a silver shortage, but don't worry, these sorts of coins aren't going to become rare. In a classic Orwellian doublespeak on the behalf of Lyndon B. Johnson. In 65, the copper-clad coins were introduced into our coinage, functioning basically, I think, as counterfeit coins. They look, they smell, they appear to be silver coins to the people of 1965, but clearly they are not. When one looks at the value of a silver coin today and one looks at the value of the copper-clad coins today, which are actually, in terms of base metal, cheaper than that 25 cents, whereas the price of silver in terms of these coins has gone up about 20 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you look at the history of the United States up until 1913, you would see pretty much a constant amount in the monetary supplies. There wasn't really any substantial inflation out there. There was brief periods when we entered into a period of war, but then it corrected itself, and that's because we actually had our money based on gold and silver at that time. And what you see since in 1913, when our Federal Reserve System took over the printing of money, it was designed, initially the charter said that they were supposed to correct the currency supply, make it more stable, yeah. Stabilize it. But what's happened since then is completely the opposite, and it's that old hockey stick graph where you see pretty much stable for 100, 150 years, and then it just goes straight up from there. And that's what we see now. We see the rampant inflation. We see the heartache of the people and the struggle to try to make ends meet, and that's a product of inflation.
Mm-hmm. It's important that the occupiers keep in mind that not only should they be occupying Wall Street, they should also be occupying the Federal Reserve. They should be occupying their own pocketbooks and figuring out how they can remain sovereign individuals. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to Liberty Coin and Precious Metals Occupy Gold Silver Report. We will be back soon with another episode. Until then, see you later.